Okay, so Chair Woodbury, we are recording and live streaming. The warden may attend later, as I noted earlier, but the meeting is yours, sir.
Okay, thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Here we go to start a week. So we'll see how it starts. So I'll call the meeting to order. And if anyone has any declarations of interest, you can declare now or at any time through the meeting. Next on our agenda is the presentation. And I'll need a mover and seconder to put it on the table for the motion that was there. So Sue will move it and Shirley will second it. And Stefan, I think I'm turning it over to you, or is it to you, Randy?
I can do some introductory statements and then I'll turn it over to Stefan and his team to go through the slide deck. So thanks Chair Woodbury, and good morning, everyone. So the purpose of today's meeting is to present the growth forecast that have generated by Hempson, present the updated 10-year historical development charges capital inventory. They've also calculated the maximum funding envelopes for each of our service areas, as well as present a draft DC capital program that identifies some capital projects that may be DC eligible in it, and then of course talk about next steps. So Hempson has worked with various departments to update the historical capital inventory and the draft capital program, and they prepared a presentation that has been included with the agenda today. I should also note that Transportation Services have also prepared maps showing the location of the various category 1 to 5 capital projects, and those were included with the agenda as well. So when we get to the category 1 to 5 projects, you can also refer to the maps, which may assist with showing where those various road projects are located. Ultimately, staff and Hempson are seeking direction to proceed with finalizing the development charges background study, and then to move forward with a public meeting to receive any comments or feedback from local municipalities, the development community, and from the general public. So that's the ultimate goal of today's session. And so now I'll turn it over to Stefan from Hempson, and he's joined with Rachel and Courtney from Hempson. And Stefan will go through the presentation today.
Okay, thank you, Randy. Thank you, Warden, and members of committee. Rachel's going to be sharing the presentation, and thank you, Rachel. There it is. So, as Randy mentioned, really the purpose of today is to update you on the progress of the development charge background study, and more specifically, the key inputs and assumptions that have been developed to calculate the new DC rates. And as Randy mentioned, those are obviously the growth forecast, the service levels and funding envelopes, and not some of the DC capital program, but actually all of the projects are listed in your presentation, which makes for quite a long presentation. And so we do apologize for the volume of material you have in front of you, but I think we wanted to just make sure that it's out there for you well in advance of you seeing the background study, so that if you have, this doesn't necessarily be done today. This is a material you can chew over for some time before we get the background study in your hands. But essentially, this is the capital program that we've worked with your staff to develop for DC purposes. And then we'll just conclude with a few next steps and sort of key points for council decision making that are coming. Rachel, my screen is a little frozen. Is everyone else's, or is that just me?
Mine is frozen. I'm sorry. I'm not sure why I can't get it to play.
So
I can share mine.
I was going to suggest the same thing, but
whatever's easier, Stefan.
Okay, I have it up on my screen. So why don't we swap out here, Rachel? Can everyone see that? Great.
Yes.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about growth. In keeping with this committee's directive from last April, you'll remember that we're now going to be following a county-wide approach to calculating the development charges. That is to say that we're going to calculate the charges so that all development in the county pays the same rate regardless of its location. And the rate's been calculated based on 2 planning horizons. So we're going to seek to recover costs for all of the services, the so-called general services, over a 10-year period into the future, extending to 2031. And then for the roads, where we have a little bit more information about the capital needs a bit further into the future, we're going to use a 20-year planning horizon to 2041 to calculate the rates for the roads. Recognizing, and we may come back to this, that the roads program is based on a transportation master plan that is somewhat out of date. And principally, it's out of date because it is not predicated on the kind of rapid growth that we've seen in the very recent past in the county, and that is now assumed for moving forward over the long term. And so we're working with a roads plan that's a little disconnected from the growth forecasts. So it may well be missing certain projects. We've tried to sort of address that. We've tried to address the timing of some of the projects that might be required, but there is fundamentally that disconnect there. So the final thing about the growth forecast is that it is, of course, consistent. Oh, Mr. Warden, I see a hand up.
Sorry, go ahead, Alar.
Yes, thank you. On the roads plan, which transportation master plan are we talking about? Because I understand even the latest one wasn't entirely approved. And there's, in the road transfers and things are not in there. And so I'm just wondering, what is the basis of which plan are we talking about? Like if we wanted to go look at the plan, which one are you basing it on?
I can speak to that. So the plan is based on the 2015 Transportation Master Plan that was received by council, and there was an accompanying staff report that identified a number of action items that to proceed with based on those recommendations in the Transportation Master Plan. So that's what Stefan's indicating with respect to the Transportation Master Plan that's being discussed today. And Stefan, we'll get into this a little bit later, and we've got, of course, Pat and Trevor connected in as well, speaking to utilizing, of course, the most recent capital plan, 10-year capital plan, as well as some other projects that have been flagged in our county official plan, et cetera, that will that we've utilized to put in as part of this this DC capital program.
So when we're looking at this, the other question is, in 20 years is a longer horizon, and if we get to automated cars and things like that, how are potentially huge differences, like the need to have sensors and you know, conduit for fiber and all this kind of stuff in our roads, how do we factor that in if we're looking 20 years out? Like, I know it's hard to tell what it'll look like, but from what I read, you know, there's going to be huge differences in road design as we move toward that. And, you know, technology is increasing all the time and the pace of change is faster. So how do we factor in the need for a different engineering standard for the roads going forward?
I could speak to that. Yeah, that is kind of things that are coming, obviously. I mean, that technology is out there, you know, in it, you know, fairly rudimentary for our needs, I guess, in this area. So we didn't really tie all that in. I mean, yeah, we don't know exactly what that's going to look like. So, you know, we're proceeding under the best kind of standards we have now. but it's not really our job to guess at what technology is going to be in 20 years either. Even with automated vehicles and stuff, there's still going to be a lot of traffic. Assuming it'd be more efficient, I guess. It's hard for us to kind of quantify what that would be.
Thank you.
Hi, Kim. You have a
Hello. Oh, well, just to add that certainly this is a living document, and we revisit it as frequently as we need to, but certainly within that 5-year time horizon. And I think that we can anticipate that we'll have a lot more and different information at the next update of this forecast than we do today. But I'd like to hear from Stefan on that a little bit too. Stefan, when you thinking about all of your clients, are they taking a similar perspective on all of that?
Yes, through you, Mr. Warden, Kim's absolutely right. I mean, we are, of course, looking 20 years into the future, but this bylaw has a term limit of 5 years. And this exercise, if you continue to impose DCs, this exercise will be repeated 4 times at least before we get to, the end of that 20-year period. So there's lots of opportunity to make adjustments to the rates and to the capital programs to reflect the ongoing technological change that is occurring.
Thank you.
So, of course, the forecast is being done in parallel with the county growth management strategy update. And those of you who sit on the committee that's sitting on Thursday will receive a presentation on that material. What you're seeing today then is entirely consistent with what you see on Thursday. And for those of you who are sitting on Thursday, I apologize for the repeat. So just talk a little bit about the growth forecast, save the detail for Thursday, but you'll remember that when we're doing development charges, the DC Act requires that in calculating DCs, the county must forecast the amount, type, and location of development for which you're going to impose a charge. And ultimately, your residential development charge, which is imposed on housing units, is essentially rooted in a forecast of population and new housing. And your non-residential charge will be based on a forecast of employment and the new building space that's required to accommodate employment growth. Now, you don't currently have a non-residential development charge, but we still have to calculate one in order to establish the residential charge. And that's because when you're providing an exemption to a type of development like the non-residential sector in your bylaw, you must make sure that the cost of that exemption is not passed on as a higher charge on another form of development. So we have to calculate the full charge for everyone, and then the exemption is provided afterwards. So what this rather messy visual shows you is the pattern of population growth that's taken place in upper tier jurisdictions at the fringe of the so-called Greater Golden Horseshoe, the GTA and an outer ring of municipalities that surround the GTA. And you can see right from the get-go that there was a very sharp uptick in population growth round about the time of the 2016 census. And it's pretty universal in all directions around the GGH. And if you look at Grey in particular, it's quite stark. Growth, had been fairly rapid in the early part of the century, and then fairly flat for a good 10 years leading up to 2016. And then suddenly we had this increase in population. And you can see that also in Bruce. The pattern's somewhat the same, but certainly Simcoe, Oxford County is particularly stark as well. So this is what we've seen in Grey is not particular to Grey. It's a phenomenon we've seen in all of these places at the fringe of that fast-growing region to the south. It begs the question as to why is this happening? And there are several factors at play, some of which we haven't quite got our heads around yet. But certainly the demographic factors are fairly clear. And that is that in the last 5 years, we have a double cohort of people seeking to purchase homes, particularly single detached homes. And so the baby boom generation last year turned 60. And so they are still very active in the housing market. And we also have the millennial generation who just turned 30 last year, who are entering the housing market for the first time. So that's putting a huge pressure on the housing market. Part of that spills over into a long-standing problem that's been developing with housing affordability, particularly in the GTA. And that is driving people to look further afield for housing, and particularly people who are prepared to commute from the fringe of the area to jobs that are closer in the GTA. And that's particularly what we've seen in the Grey County context in places like Southgate, where there's a lot of development interest in Dundalk by people seeking to buy an affordable home from which they can commute to a job, let's say in the region of Peel. Also in the Grey context, we have the ongoing development of the lakeshore communities, fueled in part by baby boomers who perhaps are thinking of early retirement, or who are converting what had been a second home into perhaps a more permanently occupied dwelling. And then layered on top of that, we have, of course, the elephant in the room, COVID. And it's still, of course, unclear as to what the long-term effects of COVID are going to be. But I think for our purposes, we assume that COVID is sort of a short, sharp shock, and that the long-term implications of it are probably not too significant. Certainly, there's been a shock to the economy. But on the residential side, how that manifests itself on the residential side is we seem to have seen a bit of a spike in people who are, as I say, moving to Grey to escape the lockdown conditions in cramped quarters in the city, perhaps. We've seen an acceleration of the early retirement of the boomers, and we may have seen an acceleration in interest by millennials for affordable housing. And that will translate certainly into a high population growth in the short term. And in keeping with what we've seen in the last 5 years, much faster growth moving forward to 2046 than we have in the past, in previous forecasts. So if you look at the table on the right and you look at the annual growth rate column, you can see that it's been a fairly slow growth rate historically, but between 2016 and 2021, certainly what can only be described as a boom in population growth. And so that will moderate somewhat, but it will be certainly much more rapid than it has been historically moving forward. And you can see that the growth rate slows down as we move through the period. And that is because, like any other place in Ontario, other than very few places, the county is not immune from the overall aging of the population. So that will be a drag on growth, as it is everywhere else, notwithstanding the faster growth rate overall. On the employment side, we recognize that most of the employment growth will in fact be driven by population growth. A bigger population needs more services, and the service sector is particularly active in Grey County. Mr. Warden, I see another question.
Yeah, sorry, I'm the chair. Warden Hicks has just joined us. Welcome. And Alar, you have a question.
Yes, on the growth rates, certainly, it has been fairly modest throughout most of Grey County over the last little while. if I look at the impact numbers on the number of households, you're quite right. Southgate has grown by 4.52% over the last 2 years. And, we in the Blue Mountains at 6.9. And I think you're absolutely right. We are the closest part to the GTA, and people are commuting. But I know with COVID, the people are more and more people are starting to believe the work from home is becoming, at least part of the time, is becoming much more acceptable. So I'm really concerned that we're underestimating our growth here, because I know anecdotally, my son just moved to Meaford, and on his street, since he bought in January, there's 2 new families that have bought a house there to basically work from home and raise their kids out in the country. And people have kind of liked the working from home, because they've realized if they were commuting an hour and a half into Toronto every day, that's 3 hours a day back and forth, and 15 hours a week. And they're realizing, wait a minute, over the last year, I've had an extra 15 hours a week, So there is a huge, anecdotally, at least here from the real estate agents and stuff, there's a huge movement, and really the limits to how far people will work from their workplace in the GTA, has kind of increased, because they're only going in 2 days a week rather than 5. So when I look at the growth rate that you're projecting of a little over 1%, I mean, certainly that historically that's high for here. But when you look at historic growth rates for like Innisfil and places that were closer to the GTA, which may now be, that distance that people are willing to be from their workplace may have expanded because of the work from home. And certainly we're seeing that in real time here. What is the effect of getting it wrong by, say, the growth rate is not going to be the annual growth rate is not going to be 1%, but will be 2%. What's the impact of that on our development charges, of getting that wrong by that much?
Well, through you, Mr. Chairman. I think getting it wrong by an order of magnitude of 100% effectively would be quite dramatic. I think that the work at home phenomenon is part of what I've already been describing. So we're certainly cognizant that part of the reason for the movement by younger families to purchase homes in Southgate is the fact that they have the opportunity now to perhaps not have to make that drive every day of the working week. The other thing about the work at home, I suppose, is that it really only affects people who work in offices. And it's a little uncertain right now as to whether the major office employers, the extent to which they're going to, how they're going to react to this new experiment that we've all been under. And so I don't know the answer to that. And depending on, what day you read the paper, you'll see, some of the banks saying, well, we want all our workers back in the city as soon as, the lockdown lifts. And that's just that. And others that will say, well, we need to be more flexible. Otherwise, we're going to lose our employers to, to other businesses. So I think that probably there's a middle ground to be found there, but certainly that idea of people working from home and that that features into some of the assumptions that you see in the growth rate we put forward. And bear in mind that phenomenon is going to also occur in Innisfil and all of the other places that are competing with you for this kind of growth as well. So.
Yeah, and just on one follow-up, Mr. Warden.
Go ahead, Owen.
Okay, so the like when I look at that growth rate, I'm aware there's a major development. Well, just one developer is building a big subdivision in Meaford, Looncall, and they apparently they have 200 homes going in Markdale as well, in Grey Highlands. Well, over the next 2 years. So if you look at that, that's 200 homes. That's 4% growth in 2 years, and translates to a 2% growth rate for those two communities, just on the basis of that one development. So how much did we factor in all the projects that are in the pipeline, Randy?
Yeah, through you, Chair Woodbury. So we did share all the proposed developments, all the current draft approved developments, all the ones that are recently final approved with Hempson to help provide and shape the growth forecast and growth projections. So that information was provided to Hempson. Going back to the one question in terms of from a development charges, I guess, impact, say if the growth was higher than what was anticipated or currently projected, I guess, and Stefan can correct me if I'm wrong, we'd be then collecting more development charges than what was originally anticipated. But what that means, though, is that if the growth is higher than what we're currently projecting, then we're going to have to make adjustments to our capital program. And as Kim indicated, this is a document that's living, needs to be constantly reviewed and updated at least every 5 years. And so that's something that we would need to review and adjust. If we're finding that the growth is higher than what was projected, then we're going to have to take a look at that capital program, bump up projects potentially, with the benefit of having, I guess, collecting a bit more in terms of development charges. Then we're able to hopefully be able to respond to some of those projects quicker, as well as maybe even add new programs and projects going forward in order to be ready for that growth that we're seeing. So, but again, Stefan can correct me if I'm wrong there, but I think that's the potential so-called implications if the growth forecasts are slightly less than, say, what we could be getting down the road. It can go the other way too, right? So if the growth forecasts are a little bit higher than we're collecting, then the growth we're realizing is less than what we're projecting, then we're going to be collecting less development charges than what we're anticipating. That then, again, we review the capital program. Are we on the right track? If not, then we maybe look at delaying some capital projects or in the capital program. So, but Stefan, I don't know if you have anything further to add there.
No, I think you've laid it out very well. And in fact, that's what happened in the last 5 years. You've over-collected DCs because of the growth was not anticipated, and you're sitting on some quite healthy development charge reserve funds as a result. And one of the reasons why we do this every 5 years is to do a sort of a re-accounting of everything and making sure that things come back into line. So the reserve funds you have on hand have been applied to in the calculations that we're doing right now, and have a downward pull on the rates themselves. I suppose the other thing just to say is that from a strictly municipal finance perspective, it is probably better to over-collect than under-collect. So it's better to err on the side of caution with development charges. I mean, obviously these forecasts have been prepared with the view of getting it right. But from a straight financial perspective, it is probably better to over-collect than under-collect.
Thank you.
So just back to the employment forecast. Again, we'll get into this in more detail on Thursday, but you can see the growth rate here on the right-hand column of the table. You see historically it's been negative growth in some periods, but certainly quite sporadic. And then moving forward, we're assuming positive growth, not as fast as the population growth, but certainly positive growth and very different from what we've seen in the past. So for development charge purposes, we're really interested in the population that's going to be occupying the new development, because it's those people and those units that will ultimately are driving the need for the expansion of county services. And on the residential side, that will include people who are living in both permanently occupied units as well as seasonal homes. So we layer in a seasonal forecast on top of the permanently occupied residents. So the forecast is for around 5,100 units over the next 10 years. That would include seasonal units. And around 9,700 units over the 20-year period to 2041. And then if you look at the bottom line here of the table, the population living in those units would be about 12,000 people over the next 10 years and 22,700 over the 20-year time horizon. And then on the employment side, as I say, we use job growth as a proxy for the increased need for county services. So it's 3,400 new jobs over the next 10 years, and about 6,800 jobs over the next 20 years, most of them related to the population, that is sort of service sector kind of jobs. And the charge that's ultimately imposed is on new building space. So we translate the jobs forecast into a forecast of space. And the space forecast is shown at the bottom here. It's about 241,000 new square meters of floor space over the next 10 years and 491,000 new square meters of floor space over the 20 years. This is very different from the kind of forecasts that were brought forward in 2016. So if we compare the 10-year population growth in the new units in 2016 from what they are today, they are around 2,800 more people than what we thought back in 2016. And if we look at the long-term growth, the 20-year time horizon, it's about 4,300 more people in the new development than what we thought 5 years ago. And on the non-residential side, it's even starker. There was very little employment growth forecast in 2016 in the near term. And so considerably more non-residential building space within the 10-year window and indeed over the long term as well. And so all other things being equal, a higher growth forecast has the effect of reducing the charge. Because if you're funding the same amount of costs, all you're doing is distributing those costs across more development. So just bear that in mind as we move forward. The other thing that we should be mindful of is that the increase in the employment growth from 2016, as we've seen, is higher than the increase in the population growth. And what that does is it shifts the allocation of the benefits of the services that the county is providing away from the residential sector and towards the non-residential sector. So in 2016, for example, we allocated all the costs, 98% of them over the 10 years to the residential sector. And now that split is around 78%, 22%. And when it comes to the roads, which comprises the majority of your charge, back in 2016, we allocated 85% of the roads costs to the residential sector. And now it's more like 77% over the long term. So again, the effect of this, all other things being equal, the effect of this will be to reduce the residential charge and increase the non-residential charge.
Thank you. Alar, do you have a question?
Yes. Where do we see, that's a big shift. So what's driving that shift to non-residential? Because as the economy, as people purchase more stuff online, you know, all of that, we're becoming more connected, and you would think that, there would be less malls, less of that rather than more of that. So what is driving the big shift toward the non-residential?
Well, through you, Mr. Chairman, that's certainly true, but that really affects only the retail sector. And when you look at the economy of Grey, it's certainly a little bit more diverse than that. There's employment in the rural areas. That's quite a significant part of the employment in Grey, and we anticipate that holding steady and continuing to develop. There's a lot of jobs, even in the retail sector, there's a lot of jobs that are required in order to manage that new online economy. So we've seen an explosion of warehouse and distribution activities, and you need employment lands for that sort of stuff. There's a lot of other businesses that require business parks, industrial lands. So there's a fair amount of employment on those that are baked into the employment forecasts. In the Grey County context, when we talk about population-related employment, we're talking about a very large tourist sector as well. So there's a lot more than just the retail economics. And even in the retail, there's a lot of local retail that really can still only be done by people on the ground in the locality. So that includes your Tim Hortons and grocery functions and all that stuff as well.
Okay, so we're assuming more of the warehouse and that kind of thing in here. Is that correct?
Yes, I mean I wouldn't want to say that that's a significant part of the shift, but certainly to the extent that people are purchasing more and people are purchasing more online, the distribution networks are certainly responding to that, and that will play into the need for certain types of employment land in Grey for sure.
Okay, thank you.
So moving away then from the forecasts, you'll remember from our presentation in April that the second step of the calculation is to look at historical service levels. These set a maximum funding ceiling or funding envelope on each service that essentially puts a limit on the amount of development charges that you can impose for each service. And so we have to spend a lot of time looking over the last 10 years to determine the quality and quantity of service that's been provided, and those will be used to establish the historic service levels, and in turn, the maximum allowable funding envelope for each service that can be raised through DCs. And this table here just summarizes the results of all of that work. Excuse me. These will all be documented for each service in detail in the background study, but we've just summarized them here on the screen for you today. So if you look, these are the services for which we've calculated a charge on the left. And then in the first column of figures is the service level that was calculated back in 2016. It's either a dollar per capita or a dollar per capita and employment. And you can see the next column to the right is how the service level has changed over the last 5 years. And for the most part, it's gone up. It's gone up in part because of the inflation of the value of your existing assets, but you've also acquired new assets. You've built more social housing units. You've built a land ambulance station at Chatsworth, for example. And in some cases, we also have better records of what you have and its value as well. So, for example, on the land ambulance, part of the increase in the service level is that we've relied on a 2020 building condition assessment that gives a fairly up-to-date value of the construction of those buildings, which we didn't have back in 2016. And then if you look at the two right-hand columns of figures, you see the funding envelopes. So just so that we're clear on what these figures mean, this is what you'd need to spend in theory for each service in order to maintain your 10-year historic level of service. And you can see that the funding envelopes are, again, correspondingly higher because you have a lot more growth that you would need to service in the future, and so the funding envelope needs to be higher in order to make sure that you maintain your service level in the face of faster growth. Now, the funding envelopes are theoretical. You can't just set the development charge based on what you could, in theory, spend. The Development Charges Act requires that you itemize future capital costs in the DC study, and that the capital works that are to be funded be identified and reflect Council's intentions to provide service or expand service into the future. And moreover, we have to make sure that the costs that are brought forward into the charge exclude any external funding that you're going to receive by way of grants, subsidies, and other contributions. We have to exclude any costs that are deemed to benefit the existing residents in gray. We've talked a little bit about this, we have to account for any development charge reserve funds you have on hand that are available to fund the costs. And then to the extent that a portion of the costs of large pieces of infrastructure extend beyond our planning horizons, we have to account for any so-called post-period benefit of that infrastructure, and that can't be funded either. So there's a lot of work that's gone into developing the program and making these deductions, and we've spoken to all of the departments in coming up with the list of projects. The key data source is, of course, the 2022 to 2031 capital budget and capital forecast. And we've taken that as essentially a baseline of Council's intentions moving forward. And we're hoping really today to go through the list of projects and confirm with you that those intentions are correct. But before we just do that, I just want to address this issue of what is growth related and what are we removing when we remove components of the cost of projects that are related to benefits that accrue to existing residents. There's really no guidance given under the DC Act and its regulation on how to do this. And so what's developed over many years is a series of conventions about how to work out the growth relatedness of a project. It's often a point of contention between municipalities and developers, and so it requires a lot of attention and it garners a lot of attention moving forward. But in very, very broad terms, we think of what's growth related. We think of growth relatedness as something that is related to the expansion of the capacity of facilities and infrastructure. So whenever you're building new facilities or expanding new facilities, we tend to think of that as growth related, but we would remove any component of a new facility that was replacing an existing facility, for example. We would also remove an improvement to a facility that was simply a qualitative improvement, unless that qualitative improvement was contributing to enhancing the capacity of that facility to provide services to more people. We also we have the ability to look under the legislation to pull in costs that have been previously made by the county. So to the extent, for example, that you have incurred debt to finance previous investments, we can continue to fund a portion of the debt through future development charge studies. And we've done that in the case of the Chatsworth Land Ambulance Station. And there is also a provision to claw back capacity that's been created in the past, that's excess capacity right now, but is available and has been created to provide service for growth moving forward. And that's come into play as well when we look at, for example, the Grey Bruce Health Unit. And we'll come to that in a few slides. Working out the benefit to existing component for roads is always a little tricky because most roads have a very broad benefit for all those who are traveling across them and across the county road network. It's very difficult to sort of pinpoint where the benefit of a road begins and where it ends. So we tend for the DC to focus on very specific roadworks, those that enhance the capacity of the network to address increased traffic that's arising from new development. When we think about the benefit to existing of these works, we tend to think of that, to the extent that part of the cost of these roadworks is also helping to maintain the existing roadway in a state of good repair, those costs are generally thought of as the benefit to existing component, and they're generally removed from the development charge calculation. There's also a provision under the Act that allows us to fund, as well as the services, the studies and master plans that are associated with developing the capital programs. And so, you'll see that there's a lot of studies and master plans in the program as well. So now propose to go through the program, and again, there's a lot of detail here. I do not propose to go through each cell and each figure line by line. That's going to take us forever. So this is very much a reference document. I'm just going to sort of provide the highlights. Of course, happy to answer any specific questions as they come, and we have all the staff on hand as well. I'm sure I'll be deferring to them on some of these, but simply propose to go through each service, service by service, and lay out the highlights of the capital program. And so these tables that follow, you'll see the project in the first column on the left that's being considered, the proposed timing of the project in the next column, and the gross cost, the total cost of the project in the third column. The fourth column identifies any grants or subsidies the county is receiving to fund those gross costs. And the fifth column identifies any components of the costs that will benefit existing residents. And then the final three columns deal with the growth-related costs and how they propose to be funded. So if you see the first column of the development-related costs is called prior growth. We call it prior growth because it reflects monies that have been collected from prior development and are sitting in your reserve funds that can be used to fund the costs. And then the middle column are the costs that will benefit development within our planning horizon. In Land Ambulance's case, it's over the next 10 years. And then in cases where we hit the funding envelope, the benefit of those costs will spill into or over our planning horizon beyond 2031. Okay. And you'll see at the bottom there that we put the funding envelope in place. So for Land Ambulance, we have a funding envelope just over $1 million. We are hitting that envelope of $1 million. And so there's $3 million of growth-related costs in the program that you can fund through DCs, but you'll only be able to fund those costs through future DC studies, because right now we're hitting the cap. So I'll deal with this one a little more detailed than I deal with the others. So, if you look at the first line here, we have 2 new cardiac monitors and defibrillators, gross cost of $1.7 million, and no grants or subsidies, no benefit to existing. It's entirely development related, but because of its timing quite late in the period will fall into the post-period benefit column. In the second line, we have currently the county has rented space to provide service in Durham, and that's going to be replaced by a new facility in 2025 at a cost of $1.6 million. A portion of that, $320,000, is a benefit to existing share to reflect the fact that the new facility will replace the existing rented space. And there are also financing costs for the Durham base, assuming that the county will pay for the facility using debt. That's in the fourth line. And then in the third line, we have the repayment of debt that the county incurred to pay for the Chatsworth Station expansion in 2018. Okay. And again, the prior growth will be used, the existing reserve funds will be used to pay for a portion of that, that debt. On the social housing side, we have a large funding envelope of $4.3 million. And we understand that the county is committed to adding to its social housing stock over the next 10 years. So provision has been made for 30 new units in 2025 and 30 new units in 2026, $8.4 million each. These represent an expansion to the existing stock of housing, and so there's no benefit to existing to be had there. A portion of it can be funded from existing reserve funds, but because we are hitting the funding envelope with this investment, a significant component of these growth-related costs will be a post-period benefit. Again, you can raise the money from DCs to pay for that $12.5 million in the final column, but only through future development charge bylaws. You will have to find some kind of interim financing to pay for them when they come along in 2025 and 2026. Children's services, it's a relatively modest funding envelope of $173,000. There's been no identified need for facility expansion, but certainly likely towards the end of the 10 years, the county will need to conduct a study to prepare for post-2031 expansion. And so we put a placeholder at the end of the 10 years for a strategic plan for $50,000. And a portion of that is being brought forward into the rate.
We have a question. Alar, did you have a question?
On the children's, going back to the Children's Services Capital Program. So on that, the no identified need, yet on the, I'm just trying to get my head wrapped around how does that, we see an increased need for a lot more commercial space or employment lands, right? Well, presumably, you know, the workforce is going to be parents, and so we've increased the employment part, but we don't collect DCs on commercial. And then how does that work into this calculation? Because then presumably residential has to bear this, but I don't, in my mind, it's hard for me to reconcile the no need for additional children's services, yet we're increasing our employment square meters by a huge amount and actually shifting over to that. So maybe somebody could explain that to me?
Looks like Randy's all set, raring to go. So go ahead, Randy.
I'll try and take a stab at that. It's a great question, Councillor Swever. Thanks for raising that. Planning and social services staff, Tara, Barb Fetty. We also have our playing data analysis coordinator looking at exactly that right now in terms of now that we've got the updated growth projections and forecasts from Hempson, we're taking a look at, although right now there's not anything identified in the 10-year capital plan for any facility expansion when it comes to children's services or early on. Just the points that you raised, Council Swever, are exactly what we are looking at to see if that should be changed. So part of that is we're actually working, although we'll be doing maybe an update in 10 years time, we're actually doing some of that initial work as we speak to look at the growth forecast and then to determine whether or not there's needs, especially in certain areas where we're seeing maybe more growth than in other areas, especially where the demographics are different. Like you said, noted Council Swever, where we're seeing maybe families locate, for example, in the Dundalk area. Do we need more early on children's service spaces, for example, in Dundalk or other communities throughout the county where we're seeing that growth or anticipating that growth occurring? So that's exactly what we're working on right now as between the planning and social services staff. And we'll be probably, they do have a current 5-year plan, but we're actually looking at updating that based on the new growth projections and forecasts, and then looking to determine whether or not there's actually going to be a need for additional space. That can be captured as part of future development charge reviews or updates, but we anticipate that there will be likely a need to expand some children's services spaces in certain communities for sure. So that's what we're actively exploring further right now. And I don't know if Barb's on the line or if Kim has anything further with respect to that, but that's what we're looking at as we speak.
I think Kim has something, and then Shirley after that.
Thanks so much. I guess just to be clear about the county's role in childcare, right? That licensed childcare spaces in Grey County, we're supporting the spaces, if you will, through the provincial funding that we receive and from some levy dollars, but we don't operate those centers. So our investments from a capital perspective would primarily be about the early on centers like the one in Hanover, which are places where parents and children can have access to enrichment activities and learning activities, but it's not a child care situation there. And so just to be clear about that. So we're not building daycare centers with our capital.
Yeah, great point, Kim, for sure.
Yep, thank you. Shirley.
Chair Woodbury, and a different question, if I may. Councillor Swever mentioned Loon Call coming to Meaford, and a big part of the reason why they've chosen to come to Grey is because of our development charges being considerably less than where they were building prior to this being focused in the Muskoka area. So I'm just wondering, in relation to that, is there a competitiveness factor that plays into establishing development charges for Grey County at all, or are we primarily focused overall? I know we are on the needs, but I'm just wondering where the competitiveness factors in, or if it does at all as we calculate these charges.
So through you, Mr. Chairman, I can probably address that. So, and I should have been clearer, Councillor, at the beginning of the presentation here, in that essentially, if you think about the background study as two quite separate processes. The first is to prepare what the maximum permissible rates could be, as are laid out in the background study. That's what the background study does, is it lays out, this is what the county could charge under the Act. That's the first process, and then we release the background study to the public. And then the second process is a process which addresses, among other matters, the matter you've raised, which is what are the rates does council want to actually impose, recognizing it couldn't impose anything more than what's set out in the background study. And that's where, you will consider policy matters like, who do we want to pay the charge? Are there certain forms of development who we want to pay less, or in the case of non-residential right now, not at all? Are we interested in providing an economic development incentive to certain forms of development to make sure we get what we need? Those sorts of things come into play. But that in respect is a process that will follow, and we've certainly left time to make sure that that those sorts of discussions can be had through the overall process. But what we've been focused on today is the maximum charge that the county could impose.
Thank you.
Okay, moving on. And actually, I should say that we haven't got a slide in here for Provincial Offences Act services, because that too was a service where it was determined that there was no need for expansion of facilities and no need for the expenditure of capital dollars to expand POA services. And so there's no charge that's been calculated for the POA. So moving to the parks service, and when I say parks, essentially this is the county trail network and its related service. There's 3 pages of these projects, and if you look at the 3rd page, you'll see that there's a funding envelope of $534,000 for this service. The first line item is a generic provision for improving the network as a whole through stone dusting and grading. And this is very much a sort of one of those qualitative improvements that I was describing earlier. So there's a very small portion of the overall cost that's actually been brought into the charge here, because the benefits of these kinds of improvements are thought to sort of improve everybody equally, whether it's new development or the people who are currently living in the county. So there's only about 10% of that that's been brought into the charge. And then all of the other projects that are listed here are very specific investments in very specific at very specific locations in the network. And there, the benefit to existing is around about 75%. So we're bringing in this slightly more into the charge than for the more generic qualitative improvements. And that's because the specific improvements at these locations often involves an actual expansion of, for example, the parking facilities, or it involves the installation of new amenities that are not there right now, like benches or privies or signage and landscaping, that sort of thing. But these investments occur across the entire county trail network, and it's only the expansion components that are being brought into the development charge itself. So again, I don't propose to go through each one of these items. In the grand scheme of things, they are fairly small cost items. So I think the largest one is about $150,000, which when we come to the roads, you'll see is a fairly minor component of the overall charge. But that's the full list there. So we're not hitting the funding envelope here. If you look at the bottom row, second column from the right, you'll see we're seeking to fund through the rate about $169,000, and that is below the funding envelope of $534,000. So moving on to the public health unit. Back in 2006, when the county first imposed development charges, there was at the time a major expansion taking place, 60,000 square foot expansion taking place to the Grey Bruce Health Unit building in Owen Sound. And the county paid for a portion of the $15 million cost of that facility. Around $2.2 million, I think, was incurred by the county. And ever since then, it has raised money through development charges to repay the growth-related component of that investment. And the final share of that recovery will be in 2022. And it can be paid for through the existing development charge reserve funds that have been collected of around $18,500. So there's no development charge that is warranted here under this bylaw because, again, it's deemed that there's no need for further expansion to the health unit. And we've come to the end of the period where we can justify funding the investment that was made, whatever it was, 16 years ago. Excuse me. So this will be there will be no charge essentially for the health unit. That's not the case with long-term care. Right now, the county does not have a long-term care charge. And as you know, the county owns and operates 3 long-term care facilities, Rockwood Terrace in Durham, Grey Gables in Markdale, and Lee Manor in Owen Sound. The county, we understand that the county is committed to 2 major refurbishments and expansions to Rockwood Terrace and Grey Gables in 2022 and 2025. And to the extent that the capacity of these facilities is being expanded, you are in fact adding 28 beds at Rockwood and 62 beds in Grey Gables. A portion of this is eligible for development charge funding, but it's only a small portion. So it's there's about 92% of the Rockwood expansion costs of $36 million that are considered to be a benefit to existing, $33 million. And about 83% of the total cost of the Grey Gables expansion is also considered to be a benefit to your existing residents. But what is carried forward into the development charge is certainly enough to hit the funding envelope of $5.5 million. And indeed, there will be a further $3.3 million that will be eligible for DC funding under future DC bylaws.
Go ahead, Kim. Oops, I think you must be muted.
Sorry, apologies. Stefan, Randy and I have had some conversations about this. I want to be really clear because we've not done this in the past. Long-term care is an interesting item in that, we don't control who goes into long-term care or where they come from, anything like that. This allocation and how you've described how the portions of the funding that would either be benefit to existing or development related, is this based on work that others have done in other counties?
So through you, Mr. Chairman, long-term care has always been an eligible service. Mm-hmm. Although only explicitly in the recent legislative amendments did they, for the first time, explicitly say that municipal governments can fund long-term care. So there was always a bit of pushback saying, oh, well, you should never be funding long-term care because it's, how can it possibly be development related to development? It's not old people buying new homes.
Right.
So that was kind of the thinking. And yeah. we always pushed back very strongly against that. It never sort of went to the tribunal or anything like that. But there was always a bit of a pushback that you should never really be having a development charge for long-term care. So that's clearly now not the case. So we can impose a charge for this service. But of course, the question you're asking is, how do we get the benefit to existing right? And
how do you get the development related part of it right? Because the beds are the beds that we have.
That's right.
We don't get more beds because they don't move in lockstep to the population at all.
That's right. And, I mean, I think our approach is to first of all acknowledge that, anytime you're going to be doing an expansion, we have to recognize that there's going to be a significant benefit to existing.
Yes.
And in this particular case, there is not only a benefit to existing, there's also a replacement share.
Yes.
Because most of the beds, you are just replacing existing beds with newer, nicer beds with higher standard of care.
Mm-hmm.
So all of the costs associated with that replacement have been removed from the DC. And then what we're left with is the costs that's only associated with expanding the new beds. And there, our approach to parsing that is to say, well, we're not going to fund the entire portion of that, but we are going to fund that portion that you would need to spend in order to make sure that in 10 years' time, you still have the same number of beds per capita. In other words, we're applying the DC theoretical framework, which say you can't use DCs to expand your service levels. And we're saying, well, if you're going to have this amount of growth in the next 10 years, how many beds would you need to build in order to have the same number of beds per capita in 10 years' time? And if you're building more beds than that, we won't fund those. But if you're just maintaining your service level, we will fund those. And that's the approach we've used here.
Okay. So so the fact that with the expansion, the additional beds, a portion of which the province funds through the construction funding that we receive.
So we haven't assumed we've assumed that these costs are county costs.
Okay. And I think maybe go ahead, Randy, but it's about a 60-40 split between the province and the county as far as when you net out what the construction funds will cover as far as the cost of a new bed. But I'll leave it there.
Yeah, further to that, if I may, Chair Woodbury, I think there will be a portion of that, and Mary Lou and I have had some chats actually as we speak through Teams. But I think we're going to need to reflect what is not covered by the province and what is on the county's dime, so to speak. So that will also need to be a factor that's in this. So these numbers may adjust a little bit based on that number crunching. So we'll have to. Based on, I guess we would have to look at our latest known amounts and figures based on what the province may fund and what the county would be responsible for, and then adjust some of these numbers to reflect that. So I think there will be a portion in the grant subsidies column, for example, that would reflect what the province will be funding, and then the portion that Stefan indicated is what is the allocation. Or what can we then attribute to a DC eligible amount? We'll need to reflect that just in the funds that the county would be funding. So I think there will be some adjustments to these final numbers as part of the DC background study for sure.
And my apologies, Stefan. We are having a discussion with the province later this week to discuss the terms of the development agreements that go with each of these projects. So we're all working in real time here, so I'm sorry that.
Oh, not at all. I mean, I mean, this is one of the reasons for doing this exercise is to cover all these moving targets.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you for that, Kim. Okay, so I guess the upshot then here is that although the framework for funding the facilities, we will still apply. We haven't yet accounted for the provincial funding that might be available, and we will work over the coming weeks to make sure we've identified that correctly. And so this is a separate charge for studies that are related to development, and for managing growth in part or in whole. And again, I don't propose to go through the studies. There are 2 pages of them here. Suffice to say that there are some studies for which we are funding 100% of the costs. The development charge study, for example, and there are some studies for which we are funding almost all of the costs, but there is a small amount of benefit to existing. So the growth management study and the housing study update at the bottom there, for example, 10% of that is considered to be a benefit to existing. And then on the next page, there are some studies where we're only funding about 50% of the cost. So the age-friendly community strategy action plan update, the climate change plan, and your ongoing official plan studies and updates. A lot of that is growth management, but a lot of that is just managing and planning for the existing community and responding to the needs of the existing residents. There are lots of development charge reserve funds available to fund the development related costs of this work, $500,000. So there's only a very small amount that's being carried forward to the development charge, $32,000, if you look at the bottom there. And so then just a summary of the general services capital programs. The services on the left, and actually I'll work through the bottom row here. It's a $95 million program. The grants and subsidies will obviously be amended to reflect the long-term care funding. The benefit to existing is a significant component, $64 million. $800,000 is available in reserve funds to fund the growth-related costs. $11 million is being brought forward to the development charge calculation. And then there's a significant portion, 18.6 million, that represents a post-period benefit, mainly related to the major facility expansions in social housing and long-term care, and then the ambulance station as well. Let's just pause there because we're going to get into the roads. Any questions then about the general services? We can come back to them, of course. It's probably better to plow on because the roads is, as you know, the major component of the development charge. And there's a lot of projects here to chew over. But before we get into them, just wanted to describe how we approach the roads because they're dealt with sort of like we use a different approach depending on the road classification. And there are 6 different categories of roads that we use to do this. So the first category are called the major road projects. And these are major expansions and new roads projects that are really responding to increased traffic on county roads, especially in bottleneck areas like Town of Blue Mountains, Owen Sound, Hanover. The benefit to existing of these roads is based on the cost to maintain the road segment in a state of good repair. So we work out what that would be, and we take that off the cost of the project. And the remaining cost is considered to be the growth-related cost. Then we have a category, the upgrading a road classification, and that's exactly what it is. We're taking a particular classification of road and we're upgrading it to a higher standard. There's no new laneways being created here, but the improvements that are being made have the effect of improving the traffic flow on the road network and the capacity of the network to accommodate traffic. And again, the benefit to existing is the cost to reconstruct or maintain the road segment in its existing classification. And that's taken off the total cost. These kinds of road improvements are a little bit more widely distributed across the county, although there are many around the Owen Sound area. Then the third category has been somewhat modified from the previous background study. It now mainly captures projects that result in the widening of a roadway in order to improve safety, sight lines, and shoulders in response to additional traffic. A wider road platform also provides opportunities for active transportation, bike lanes, for example, in or near new urban areas. The benefit to existing components is quite high for the Category 3 projects. It's anywhere between 30% and 60%, depending on the project. But there are also significant costs involved with these projects. The fourth category is very specific investments in 21 intersections across the county to improve traffic flow. It could be new roundabouts, a new turning lane, the installation of traffic lights, for example. And the benefit to existing is a flat 25% on all the costs. And that's the same as it was in the previous background study and the one before that. Category 5 deals with the extension and widening of 5 culverts across the county, and Category 6 are the traffic studies and master plans. This is the summary table for all of the costs. So if just moving across the bottom here, it's a $174 million program. Grants or subsidies of just shy of $10 million have been identified. And around $65.6 million in benefit to existing shares for all of the categories.
Yeah, go ahead, Alar.
Yeah, so going back to that list, there's no bridges on there. So where does the widening of a bridge fall? Would that fall under the culvert category? I mean, if we need to go from a to a wider road and there's a bridge, I don't know, And then the other question I have is, I assume this just relates to the county roads as they exist today. With rapid growth, there may be the need to transfer roads. And I know that's been contentious because we haven't even got agreement on road transfers that were discussed in 2015. But, as we grow, it's quite likely that some roads which were previously downloaded to municipalities will see the kind of traffic that they should be really county roads. And how do we deal with any potential transfers? Because I know there's a number that people would like to discuss, but haven't made any progress on.
I could speak to those items.
Sure, go ahead.
So as far as the bridges, there were none in the Category 1 roads, like where we're doing additional lanes, etc. There was a bunch of culverts in there that we're going to widen, but no real bridges in those sections. As far as some other ones, we didn't really get into the point where we're doing major road widening that would need a bridge widening. We've had minor bridge widening anyway, just based on the current bridge code, but didn't really feel like there was a huge spot to put a whole bunch of bridges in. It would have been relatively minor anyway. So that's kind of bridges. And then just as far as the road, potential road exchanges or connecting links or any of those things, we kind of had to address the network as it was. We haven't got to that point yet. Of course, living document, that's something to be discussed if these exchanges or connecting links happen. Obviously, the funding is going to have to be addressed. Probably the biggest single thing that needs to be addressed is how the funding proceeds forward. So, but we didn't really, we couldn't really assume that council had made a decision on certain roads. We basically have to work with the network as it was.
Thank you.
Okay. So again, a fairly substantial benefit to existing component. The roads DC Reserve Fund is quite healthy. There's $18 million sitting there to fund a big component of these projects. But nevertheless, $77.5 million has been brought forward to the development charge calculation. And there are some Category 1 projects that have been identified at the back end of the 20 years, where we've assigned a post-period benefit to reflect the fact that, a lot of the capacity that they're creating will in fact benefit growth beyond 2041. And indeed, it may be that we cycle back, Pat, Randy, I haven't actually sort of brought this up with you. It may be that we need to cycle back and re-examine those ones and see whether they're actually eligible for any kind of funding at all. So I would say there's one or two here that we've included because we wanted to bring forward the sort of on the side of inclusion for today, but there are some that perhaps might be a little bit more speculative than we need. Just thought we'd also just compare some of the shifts in some of these categories that have occurred over the last 5 years. So when we look at the Category 1s and Category 2s, you can see that the cost of the program is pretty much the same, but the recoverable portion through DCs has come down. And a lot of the reason for that is the fact that you have reserve funds on hand to fund these now. When we look at the Category 3s, 4s, and 5s, you'll see that the Category 2, the cost of the program, the Category 3, the cost of the program is significantly higher, and so is the DC eligible share. And the Category 4 is the same. Those are the intersections. The costs have gone up significantly and the DC share correspondingly. And the Category 5 has gone up a little bit as well, the culverts. And then Category 6, not too much change. It's come down a little bit. So when you look at the bottom line, you can see where we had a program of about $105 million in 2016. That's now $174 million today. We were able to recover about $50 million back in 2016, and now it's a $75 million so that we can recover today. That, of course, will put upward pressure on the rates, recognizing we have a lot more growth as well. So again, I don't propose to go through each project in detail. We have the staff here. I'm sure can answer all manner of questions about the detail. And we also have the maps that you have hopefully to hand if we want to look at sort of where these are and what they might be responding to. But the projects on this page are, these are the major road projects, the Category 1 projects. And these four line items are all associated with Grey Road 1, which is coming out of the north part of Owen Sound. And the timing, starting around about 2028 and continuing into the mid-2030s. On the following page, we have these two projects associated with Grey Road 4, which is east of Hanover. In around 10 years' time. And then we have Grey Road 5, which is just south of Owen Sound in 2027. Then we have 3 line items associated with Grey Road 17B. These are west of Owen Sound, with property acquisition occurring next year. And then the first phase of construction occurring the following year in 2023. Then we have Grey Road 19, which is in the town of the Blue Mountains, phased project over many years. but the first sort of phase occurring fairly shortly in the near term, 2023 and 2024, and then another phase in 2033, and then a final phase in 2039. And again, that 2039 one might be one that we want to sort of revisit, considering how late it is in the planning period. Gray Road 21, again in the town of Blue Mountains, slated for later in the 2030s, and then Gray Road 28, which is east of Hanover, and which is slated for very early in the period in 2023.
Mr. Chair?
Yeah, go ahead, Alar.
On the property acquisition costs, how are those calculated? And like some of these are like 2037 and there's a 300 gross cost. So is that in 2037 dollars or 20 current dollars, or because 300,000 buys you a postage stamp today here in the Blue Mountains, and if property values go up some more, how much property acquisition are we proposing for $300,000? Just wondering what is the cost basis of those property acquisition numbers, and are they current dollars or future dollars?
So they're all in current dollars, Mr. Chairman, but Pat or Randy might be able to describe a little more detail about where the property is.
Yeah, maybe Pat or Trevor be able to assist in terms of, I think for the most part we have already sufficient property, but there may be some parts where we don't have the property, but I'll let Pat or Trevor clarify that.
Yeah, is Trevor on this call or no? I know he's paying attention.
Yeah, I'm
but I don't know
here.
if he's. Oh, you are. Do you want to talk about this?
For Gray Road 21 specifically, a majority of the property has already been purchased to what we would consider a 30-meter right of way, which would be what we need for that project. There is a stretch where we don't have that widening, so this cost is effectively to buy that piece, and then also there is some stuff on the Simcoe County side as well, about a similar stretch in length that we would be sharing the cost for those property because it's a 50 split on those boundary roads.
And on the Gray Road 19 portion, Trevor, do you know if is there a stretch there that we don't have the 30 meters?
Yeah, there are pieces, not so much within the piece coming up in if we go back to it, the piece toward Joseph Wider. But yeah, the part where it's 2-lane in 2039, a lot of that, the property acquisition would be more for turning lanes, which may come as part of, it'll just be getting that extra width so that we can get those turning lanes in. And then the rest of it, because it's just a 2-lane road, we can keep it within the existing property lines. There is a chance as we get closer to Highway 26 with the hill and the retaining wall there that if we widen, we may have some additional property there as well. But for the most part, the majority of that property is covered off.
And I'm assuming the current rate that we applied was based on our current land acquisition policy, which I know is slightly higher in Blue Mountains compared to other parts, but whether or not that figure needs to be revisited, because we've talked about in terms of whether or not that's reflective of the current market. But
yeah, I should mention that these numbers actually aren't using the current policy rate because we found that we haven't been able to purchase any property at that current rate, especially in Blue Mountains. So we've got a couple different assessments that we've used to get an estimate. And yeah, they've occurred within the last year or two. So there's a couple fresh ones that we're still waiting for as well that may help provide some additional value to that too. So
thanks.
No, thank you.
Anything?
That was my concern. What was the basis of the numbers? Thank you.
Great, thank you. Okay, we can carry on.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So the roads category 2, there's 24 projects in total here for the category 2 projects. This is where we're changing the classification of a roadway, a road segment. 14 of those projects are in the first 10 years and 10 of them are in the second 10 years. All have a benefit to existing share to them. They are, as I say, in various locations, both rural and, clustered around the more urbanizing areas. So Darby, you can see here, east of Owen Sound, in Meaford, just south of Neustadt as well on this page. More in Neustadt and Bentic. Clarksburg, again, east of Owen Sound. And then finally, Durham Road West in Durham. About $7.6 million being brought into the rate calculation and a slightly lower amount that can be funded from existing reserves. And quite a significant benefit to existing to these items. Around 40% of the total. And so moving then to the category 3, the platform widening projects. There's 17 of these projects. And you'll see from your map where they are located. Again, fairly spread out across the county. And the benefit to existing, as I say, extends anywhere between 30% and 60% of these roadworks. Just skipping ahead then. There's also a provision that's been made for works that are in the second 10 years. So we know about the works that are going to be required because they've been identified in the 10-year capital program, but we haven't got the benefit of a long-term master plan or a long-term capital forecast for the items beyond the 10 years. And so a portion, we've assumed that there's going to be additional requirements here in that second part of the 10 years. So we've made a provision for that moving forward. And that's a significant component of the overall cost as well. The category 4 are the intersection improvements and the intersection realignments. Again, 21 projects altogether. Some of them involve new roundabouts, like the second line item here and the 4th and 5th line item. Those are new roundabouts going in, and quite significant expenditures. And the third line item here too is also a new roundabout. And then in some cases, we have a new turning lane that is being constructed, like the 5th line item here, and all of the line items shown here. And here, except for the 3rd line item. And then that last one, the 2.25 million, that is a new roundabout as well. So $22.5 million of gross cost and $11.7 million being brought forward to the rate calculation. The culverts, 5 projects. These are all expansion projects. In the overall grand scheme of the roads charge, it's a fairly minor component. So just under $1 million being brought forward to the rate calculation. And then finally, the studies. The transportation master plan, which we've discussed, which is set for sort of a revisit in 2023 with regular updates and reviews over the next 20 years. Master plans for cycling and trails, road rationalization study, an allowance for environmental assessment work, and then where we know about specific traffic studies, they're identified as well. And various urban area drainage studies as well. But again, in the grand scheme of things, a fairly small component, just over $600,000 brought forward to the rate calculation over the 20 years. And this is actually somewhat out of sequence. There is also a small charge for services related to the roadways, the highways, but is dealt with through your public works department. And it's a carryover from the previous study where you are replacing an existing facility with a new facility in Dundalk, public works facility. And that facility will have a slightly larger sand salt dome. And so to the extent that there's a small capacity expansion, we brought the cost of that into a separate charge for public works. And a portion of that will be funded from your existing reserve funds, $450,000, and $262,000 brought forward to the rate calculation. But otherwise, your public works facilities are considered to be adequate to deal with what's coming. So just wanted to stop there. I know we've got another 15 minutes here, but wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about process and what we need from council to get us from A to B to C, and ultimately a bylaw in place, which has to be done by the end of December. Your current bylaw expires on the last day of this year, and so we need to pass a bylaw in order to continue to collect the charges. What we're asking, I suppose, this committee to do today is to consider the list of capital works that have been presented to you and direct us to proceed with calculating draft development charge rates and a draft background study on the basis of this capital program, recognizing that there are still some, I would say, minor questions to be worked out with through staff, like the funding for the long-term care facilities and some of the benefits to existing, and we'll continue to do that over the summer. With a background study in hand, we can proceed to the public process that is required under the Act, which involves a public meeting. And one of the decisions council will have to make at some point after that public meeting is to whether to hold another public meeting, which is a little unusual, but not unheard of, and it's a requirement of the Act. So that will be a resolution that will be brought forward to this committee. And then, of course, further to the councillor's earlier question about, what rates are we going to impose, we want to make sure that you have the time to be presented with any options for implementation of the rates, the maximum rates that are calculated. And that could involve exemptions, of course, the continuation of the non-residential exemption, if you wish, the discounting of certain types of development charges for certain types of development, and whether, if there is a change in the rates, whether you want to implement full rates immediately or delay implementation or phase them in. There's all sorts of options for doing that as well. And this is the timeline that we've had to sort of, it's changed a little bit since we met in April, but suffice to say, we're still working well within hitting the deadlines we need to meet in order to get to our December drop dead deadline. And so if you look at the third row here, the first gray arrow, that's where we are today, presenting you the DC capital program. Our next step will be to calculate the draft rates. And I think I think it's fair to say that you will want to see the rates before you see the study. So I think we'll be trying to identify a time in early September, I think, through Randy to come to you again and show you the rates and how they compare to what's existing and what others are charging and so on and so forth. And get your direction at that time to release a background study, which we hope to do sort of late September, perhaps early October, so that we can hold the statutory public meeting in October and pass the bylaws in December. And if necessary, hold another public meeting in November, if that's your wish. So we're on target, again, that's really all we had for you today, and I'm happy to answer any further questions, certainly about the process or indeed any of the material you've seen. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. And when you say that's all you had for us today, wow, there's a lot. That's good. Are there any questions from anyone? I'm not seeing any others right now, so I'd like to thank you on that about the presentation. Very informative. We have a motion then before us to receive this and to instruct staff or instruct Hempson to prepare the draft and staff hold a public meeting to receive comments in the future with the draft bylaw. Any discussion on that motion?
Sorry, Stefan, can I have you stop sharing so we can see the members when they vote?
It was going to be secret.
Sorry, no.
No.
Thank you.
Oh, Alar, you have something?
Yeah, I think I want to thank Stefan for his presentation, and obviously it's based on information that is provided by our staff and our current plans, but I am very concerned that, as particularly transportation is the big dollar part of this, and that, we don't have an up-to-date master transportation plan as was pointed out. And particularly when we had a big discussion on urban roads at council just a few meetings ago. And, we have also, the fact that road transfers were problematic back in 2015, 2016. And so we're basing this on our current road network and not what might actually be in place. And since we're like a good 6 years behind on dealing with this, I'm very concerned that, it greatly impedes our ability to do a good job on this. And, so, I'm very concerned about that. And, I'm just struggling whether I should vote to approve.
Okay, thank you. Any further comments or questions on the motion? Okay, seeing none. All in favor of the motion, you can just raise a hand. Okay. And opposed? And that is carried. Thank you. And yes, big thank you to staff and to Stefan and your group for all the work that's put in this. That's a big undertaking, I know. Next steps, I think we've covered that with the last slide on how things are going. For the fall and especially September. So any other business for here? Okay, seeing none. Next meeting, we'll get you to organize that and likely September. So look forward to that. And if anything's needed before that, we can always call a meeting. Okay. And did anyone have anything to say before we adjourn?
Just want to thank the steering committee today, and thanks for going through. It is a lot of information to go through, so we appreciate your time this morning. And as Stefan indicated, we'll work with Hempson to make some of those adjustments, like we talked about in long-term care, and any other adjustments. And we'll try to reflect on Councillor Swever's comments and bring back some information in terms of how we as staff, not recognizing that we do have a data transportation management plan, but making sure that, obviously the alignment with the capital plan, and we try to build in some of those unknowns, as Stefan highlighted on that one category. We know there's going to be needs in that beyond the 10-year capital. So we try to reflect that in the envelope to try to make sure that we're capturing those costs, not recognizing that, we are working from a bit of a data plan, but we do have we've aligned this with at least our 10-year capital based on what we know we need to make improvements in order to reflect and to adapt to the growth that we anticipate. But maybe as a take back, I guess, as from a staff perspective, we'll take those comments back, and we'll maybe as part of our next discussion, we'll have some further information for the steering committee with respect to that. And of course, thank you for providing us with the direction to go to the next steps. We'll of course work with Hempson, start preparing that draft background study, calculate those DC rates. Early September, we're for sure reaching. If we can meet earlier than that with the capital rates, we'll look to that. And of course, we'll give you as much advance notice for that meeting as we can. But we appreciate the steering committee's time this morning for sure.
Great, thank you. I think the other take back with this is because it's a reoccurring theme every few years. If you had a list of studies that you needed current prior to, could get different departments going on those, so that next time around we're as current as we can be and things like that. So
for sure,
there's always something to learn every process. I don't
Absolutely.
I don't care how wonderful our staff is as far as all the work you do. Something has to get missed. Like, it's just always, you learn something every single process in a changing atmosphere. So yeah, it's what you do with it afterwards. So that's a big thing. So thanks again. Anyone else? Okay, seeing none, need movers and seconders for us to adjourn. Okay, Sue and Shirley. And I assume everybody's in favor. So thank you again, everyone. And thanks for all the hard work. And I guess we'll see most of you on Thursday.
Thank you.
Sounds good. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.